Welcome to Independent Sources and our first news show of the new year. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. As the United States prepares to inaugurate its first African-American president, we continue our exploration of the foreign policy challenges Barack Obama will face. On this episode of Independent Sources, we focus on Africa. Barack Obama is the son of a Kenyan, and Africans may be anticipating a kind of attention they never got from past U.S. administrations. We'll discuss the issues surrounding this vast and multifaceted continent with two African journalists. We'll look at the fear reporters in Africa face every day. And we'll profile a Gambian journalist who fled into exile so he could speak freely. But first, Africa. Barack Obama is enormously popular in Africa, but is it more than a feel-good story? As an unstable continent hangs in the balance, will Obama be able to leverage his influence with the African states? Joining us to discuss these issues are Omoyele Sowore, a Nigerian journalist who now lives in the U.S. Also with us is Chika Onyeani, publisher of the African Sun-Times, a weekly newspaper focusing on African affairs. We have Zimbabwe, Kenya, Congo. There seems to be many problems across the continent. Where does Obama begin? Chika?
Well, first of all, I want to object to the word unstable.
Okay.
Because you are talking of 53 countries, or 53 and a half, if you were to add Western Sahara, okay, which is going to be independent too. But the thing is that, so when you take some of the countries, we have like 5 countries right now out of 53 that are quote unquote in transition. Okay. So you see that it's not that I disagree that Africa is in a bad shape, but at the same time we are seeing progress in terms of democracy, countries moving. We just saw what happened in Ghana.
But they just had a very democratic
election, which is something that, in fact, I had 2 Ghanaians, the 2 party leaders based here to discuss the issue on Friday on my radio program, All Africa Radio. And so those are the kinds of things we are trying to focus on. But at the same time, I just wrote an article, what should Africans expect from Obama?
Give us some of the highlights.
The highlight is that, he should give us tough love. That is what Obama has to do to Africa. He should tell Africans that it is time they stop behaving like children to the rest of the world. He should tell Africans that corruption should stop. He should tell them to stop siphoning the funds for development in our respective countries, siphoning it to Europe. But he should also warn European countries that they should not have this double standard of crying wolf about corruption in Africa, and then when African leaders bring the money to Europe, they accept the money into European banks.
Omoyele, do you agree that Obama should show tough love to Africa? What about the high expectations that...
Let me start by saying that there are 3 things in Africa now that's disturbing in terms of excitement. That is European Soccer League, religion, and Obama. And those 3 things...
Not necessarily in that order, right?
Well, those are the 3 things that... And they disturb me because they come from... It's an inspiration of hope from the West. It's not coming from inside of Africa. I agree with Chief Onyeani that Obama should give us tough love. But it is high time Africans stop asking for help from other people. So what Obama needs to really do is to allow Africans to take care of Africa, because for so long, because of the Cold War, slavery, the issue of resources hunting and scramble for Africa that has never stopped. Africa has not been allowed to get its act together. And that is why we're talking about all these African Union leaders. They did not emerge from Africans. Obama should connect with the African people and jettison the fallen gods. I'm talking about the African leaders. I disagree with Chief Onyeani that Africa is unstable. Africa is unstable. That's the truth. We have to understand that. We have about 10 wars going on actively in Africa, whether we admit it or not. We have several countries that are practicing some form of crazy democracy that I call morontocracy, including Nigeria, including places like Libya, Morocco, Algeria. You can count, they're countless. Ivory Coast, they are practicing a very strange form of democracy. Africans are not given the power to decide who their leaders should be, and it is because of the scramble for African resources. If Obama comes after oil, gold, diamond, he's not going to be able to help anybody. And that's what I keep telling people about Obama, that, you know, loving Obama is like watching a football game. When it's over, you go back and pay your rent. He's won now. Africans have to deal with their issues.
So, given these high expectations, how do you think people will react when they're going to see that the expectations are not going to be met? The Senegalese president has cautioned the people, saying you shouldn't expect Obama to drain money on Africa. What do you think people will say, or how will they react?
We are experiencing a time that America needs help from everywhere. So to expect anything from America at this time is actually living in a dream world. Mm-hmm. So, and I foresee a situation where America will become more aggressive, looking for resources, because it's got 300 million people to feed. You've got almost 20 million cars, you know, to give gas to. You need a lot of fingers that need diamonds, and all of the the consumer mentality that is in this society that needs to be taken care of. So until we realize that Obama is not going to be the magic wand and begin to look internally on how to reform Africa, we're not going to have any salvation. I think at this time, Americans need Obama more than anybody else need Obama. And perhaps what Obama needs from Africa is prayers and a lot of African magic.
Good point. Chika, I want to change the subject to terrorism because I think now it seems that the U.S. Policy towards Africa is to combat terrorism, particularly in West Africa and some of the Sahelian states. What do you think about this new emphasis on terrorism?
I don't know whether it is being overblown right now, because really, maybe in Nigeria.
Well, you know, they lost East Africa, Somalia, and Ethiopia. Now, the idea, I think, is to be proactive and making sure that West African nations are capable of dealing with terrorism if it comes through, and in the process, perhaps helping strengthen these countries, because part of it is to provide aid and training for young men so that they don't succumb to terrorism. Do you think it's a sound idea?
Well, it's a sound idea, but in terms of using the American military to train Africans to fight terrorism, especially in West Africa, is a good thing. Of course, we have seen what happened in Somalia, you know, which America brought about too, and of course in Ethiopia, you know, the government, that is where African Union is based, except it's a dictatorial government which doesn't allow journalists or freedom of the press in the country.
Omoyele, I'd like to ask you, what should be Obama's first priority on the continent?
Well, the most important thing on the African continent is for the dignity of the African person to be restored back to Africans. And this will have to happen in two ways. One is to make sure that African leaders are not given the free rein to oppress their people, and then get the red carpet reception in Washington, D.C., as we have now, or have the CIA and several other U.S. agencies give them backing when they are falling apart. And also, that is where I oppose the idea of the African command, because it is this same mentality of protecting and propping up dictators all over the Middle East that brought about terrorism of the size we have now. What I suspect with AFRICOM is that they want to set up Africa as another battleground between China and the U.S. in the scramble for African resources. And that is going to lead to a lot of killings and genocide all over again. The same thing we had during the Cold War. So let's forget about that. But second priority is that the African man needs food. They need education, they need health care. And all the resources that America can muster should go in the direction of ensuring that that goes to the people.
Well, Bush, even though it's very little known, he has been funding a lot of the health programs in Africa, and he increased the spending 3 times since 2000.
When I say health, it's not for Bush or any policymaker in the U.S. to choose which African disease they want to celebrate, or to have Madonna go buy babies in Africa. That's not the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about letting Africans decide what kind of disease they want to deal with. You know, most of it can be prevented. Malaria can be prevented, so you don't have to ship to Africa US-made mosquito nets. You know, just let Africans have drinking water that is clean. Let Africans have clean environment, and get rid of bad leaders in Africa that messes up the African environment. And of course, rein in the corporations that destroy the African environment and climate. It's as simple as that.
And that's all the time we have today, unfortunately.
Okay.
Chika Onyeani, thanks for being with us. Omoyele Sowore will stay with us for our next segment on the dangers of being a journalist in Africa. But first, here's Abi Ishola with some other news.
Thanks, Vianora. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic media. From India abroad, members of the Los Angeles Police Department will visit India to study tactics used in the terrorist attacks in Mumbai to prevent similar atrocities in the United States. The group of officers plan to create relationships with Indian intelligence agencies and share information with other major cities in the U.S. China Press reports that many Chinese students in the U.S. are opting to stay in school to earn another degree as a result of the bleak job market. From Iran Times International, a new poll shows that many Iranians think the United States is purposefully attempting to disgrace the Islamic world. The poll, conducted by worldpublicopinion.org, was taken in 21 nations, with Iranians being the largest group surveyed. Almost 2/3 of Iranian participants said they believe Americans hate Muslims. A growing number of transgender Jews are seeking recognition within the Jewish community. The Jewish Forward reports that advocacy and education initiatives for transgender rights have increased in the Jewish community within the past year. And finally, executives at Grace Institute say the grim job market won't affect graduates from the tuition-free business school. Caribbean Life reports that the school has developed a reputation for providing quality business skills to underserved women in New York. 62% of the school's June 2008 class are employed. Those were just a few headlines from New York's ethnic media. Back to you, Gary.
Thanks, Abby. We continue our discussion on Africa with a look at press freedom on the continent. In some African countries, journalists work with a relative measure of freedom. But in too many, they live in fear of detention and even death.
To talk about the dangers journalists all over Africa face each day, we've been joined by Tom Rhodes of the Committee to Protect Journalists. The organization promotes press freedom worldwide. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Tom, you wrote in a recent report that ballots have replaced bullets in much of Africa, talking about some countries moving toward democratic elections. And you also pointed out that in some of these countries, ironically, the elections were followed by a clampdown on press freedom. Why is this happening, and what are some of the countries who top the list of press freedom violators?
Okay, yeah, that was actually a report we released in our last book that comes out annually, The Attacks on the Press. Basically what we were arguing is that quite often people look at some of the main perpetrators of attacks on the press, like for example Zimbabwe comes up a lot in the media, right, and Eritrea, you hear about the detentions of journalists. But there are other countries in sub-Saharan Africa who, you know, have held elections, are generally applauded by America and so on, and are ignored for actually having a fairly poor press freedom record. I mean, for example, one country that's actually very worrying me at the moment this week is Kenya. I mean, people often have this kind of rosy image of Kenya, right? They think, oh, nothing's wrong there, let's leave it alone. But as we speak, the Parliament has just passed a fairly draconian media bill, which will definitely stifle press freedom and make sure that the government has a much weightier hand in controlling.
Why are these governments being democratically elected? Why do they feel the need to resort to these measures of clamping down on the press freedom, you think?
I mean, it's hard to generalize, right? I mean, when you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, you're talking about so many different countries of so varied backgrounds. I don't want to say, you know, these countries, it wouldn't be fair. But in general, if we can make a trend, what one can notice is that a lot of countries basically have a veneer of a democracy, right? They'll sort of show the ballots going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they'll get some money and support from various donor governments because of this. But in reality, when it comes to actually having a free press and a free democracy, it simply isn't there. I mean, we're even seeing that to a lesser extent, but also to some extent, even in Senegal, which is also considered a sort of a bastion of press freedom in Western Africa. In the last sort of 2 years, President Abdoulaye Wade has really started clamping down on the press. We've seen a lot more arrests, for example, and any sort of vocal criticism gets stamped down.
Omoyele, let's talk about Nigeria. I mean, you're from Nigeria, you worked in Nigeria. Last year there was elections in Nigeria. Has that helped or hurt freedom of the press?
Well, it's important to say that there were no elections last year in Nigeria, and I'm saying this speaking from reports from international observers that said, by African standards, Nigeria election was the worst. And so you can say there was a selection in Nigeria last year, but definitely not an election. And I have always said that democracy does not stand on its own. People sometimes equate democracy with voting. In Nigeria, even voting doesn't take place, which is a very important component of democracy. So where do you start from is to talk about democracy from the point of human rights, observance of civil, political, economic, and cultural rights. These all-round rights that I believe in. Those things are not happening in Nigeria because Nigeria does not practice the brand of democracy that is known to anybody. So
explain that a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I say that is that when you have elections that do not happen or that produce results, that is not a democracy.
But democracy is, we don't want to get into a debate about democracy, but it's not simply an election, it's how you govern as well, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that it can't stand on its own. But if we're to say democracy about elections, it didn't even happen in Nigeria to start with. So you still have this huge country of people who rule with their own will. And as a matter of fact, because the media challenges these people in power, they went after the media from a different angle, not from the angle of direct repression since 1999. That is happening. But what the politicians did was to buy over the mainstream media in Nigeria with money that they looted from the Nigerian treasury. So you have about 5 vibrant newspapers, television stations that are owned by the same people who are in government. So many of them actually facing trial for corruption. So that is their own style of, you know, press freedom. Of course, now it has gotten worse that government now clamps down on the media. And of course, they have gone after electronic media, I mean, our type of media, which is internet media, because we publish solely online.
You know, I was reading about you and the work that you do. You've gotten the ire of the Nigerian government. Are they going out after internet media? Do they see the internet, the web, as even more dangerous than the traditional media in Nigeria?
Absolutely, because the web you can't even locate the office of a website. It exists in cyberspace. And the Nigerian government doesn't know where cyberspace is, but they know that they get all kinds of reports from the internet. So they are looking for any way or any means to shut down the internet. They've used different means. Of course, a lot of the internet bloggers and writers who visit the country in the last 1 month has been clamped down into detention, about 3 cases, Tom will tell you. And of course, they are also employing other means, which is to look for their cronies in the West to see if they can use self-censorship approach to stop the electronic media. Like we've had threats of legal threats from some of their cronies who live in the West. You know, they say, well, you know, how don't you go see if you can sue them? Because litigation slows down people in America and stuff like that, and it forces people to self-censorship. But I'm just saying they use all kinds of strategy, and we don't know which one would work, but definitely they're not giving up on us.
Tom, what is it like to be a blogger working in Africa?
Yeah, well, exactly what Sowore says is right. I mean, actually, by a global standard, we did a recent report, and we were surprised ourselves to discover that actually 45% of all journalists in jail are either bloggers, online journalists, or, you know, solely based on the internet. And Africa is no exception. I mean, there's been a revolution in the number of internet sites that have popped up all over sub-Saharan Africa. Even though, you know, people always are pointing out that Africa is behind technology-wise, I think it really has picked up. And the dangers are there. I mean, I can think of examples in the Gambia where they're trying to sort of sort out people who are maybe affiliated to certain websites, and they try and arrest them there. But also, I mean, it's important to point out the impact of these websites too. I mean, they've done some incredible things. I won't promote my friend here, but I can give another example in Tanzania, where some pretty young guys started something called Jumbo Forums, which became basically the sort of the ground piece which got the former Prime Minister to resign on corruption charges, because it created a forum where people could, without too much you know, negative attacks on them, print sort of fairly substantial information. You know,
the media has changed tremendously with the internet. Now, has the repression changed as well? Is it more brutal because the impact is more global?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I think, Sowore was actually mentioning this before, I think the repression has changed. It's become a bit more subtle. African governments are becoming much more clever in finding ways of censoring the press. Exactly, in the 90s in Nigeria, you know, they just threw them in jails and threw away the key. And this time they're using more things like lawsuits, creating their own sort of media publications to take over.
Are foreign journalists in peril when they go covering issues in Africa? There's been an incident recently of 2 German journalists being imprisoned and then let go in one country. What was the situation there for foreign journalists?
For foreign journalists, of course, it depends on the country. Obviously, I mean, it's, you know, if you're a foreign journalist and you're going to Kenya or Uganda, there shouldn't be any problems. But Somalia, for example, is a country where there really isn't a government at all, and so foreign journalists are actually targeted because they could be sort of potential ransom money for the people on the ground. But there are other examples too, like the Niger Delta. I mean, we've had 2 cases this year in the Niger Delta where American filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, have been actually arrested by the state security services. And I'm sure Sowore can tell you more about their incident as well.
How about that?
Yeah. Your website, we want to know more about your website. I know that it has caused a clampdown on press freedom in Nigeria. What happened?
Well, our website, SaharaReporters.com, is 3 years old, and what we do on our website is it's a platform for citizen reporters, and anybody can be a citizen reporter. You know, all you need as a qualification is to be a citizen of any country, for that matter. And what we do is to just turn ordinary folks into reporters. So our focus is to fight corruption in Nigeria, which is Nigeria's biggest problem, and of course repression. And if you have people who see, for example, an STR, which is a suspicious transaction report in a bank that says a governor of a state is stealing money, he can quickly make a photocopy, scan it, and send it to us. By the time it gets to government, it's already published on our website, because we have this evidence-based section of the website. We have a library, an e-library, where you're not likely to find a book, but you can find a dirty laundry of somebody. So, and we put up this, so when we write a report, we supply the evidence immediately, and this gets people convinced. And it's a website that is popular on the account of its ability to write accurately and report accurately things that are happening. I was mentioning to you elections in Nigeria last year. We had election results 24 hours before the election took place. It's the only place in the world where you can have that, on our website and in Nigeria.
Is the Nigerian government punishing the journalists who are affiliated with your website?
Actually, the guys that are arrested are not affiliated. They are being punished on the suspicion that they might be affiliated with us because they live in the U.S., same as me.
And we'll have to leave it at that. Tom Rhodes and Omoyele Sowore, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You promised me the world. Is this what you had in mind?
Help EarthShare and its members restore balance to the world. Visit earthshare.org and see what you can do. EarthShare, one environment, one simple way to care for it.
The Republic of Gambia doesn't make the headlines like Zimbabwe or Congo, but this West African country has one of the continent's worst human rights records. Journalists in the Gambia live in constant fear. The stories they write about their political leaders can land them in prison or in the grave. We end our show with a profile producer Abi Ishola did of Osman Darboe, a Gambian journalist who fled his homeland so he could testify about the disappearance of a colleague.
Osman Darboe is at the threshold of achieving the American dream. Last year, he moved to the United States from West Africa after working there as a journalist for almost a decade.
It's challenging to live in the U.S. It is really challenging. You have to work hard to make ends meet.
Today, he is college-bound, and he manages this 99-cent store in the Bronx. But Darboe didn't choose this life. He was forced to flee his homeland.
It was never my dream to come to U.S. What my plan was like to come here, maybe either for studies or conferences and go home, but not to live in exile.
He is exiled from the Republic of Gambia, a small West African nation bordered by Senegal. The country's current president, Yahya Jammeh, came into power in 1994 through an army coup. Darboe says Gambians live in fear under Jammeh's strict rule, and journalists are constantly being persecuted for publishing stories that criticize the government.
The president will refer journalists as illegitimate sons of Africa, and he was calling on the people of the Gambia not to buy the newspapers so that journalists will starve to death.
Darboe himself was arrested countless times.
If you are under arrest, you go under a lot of maltreatments. They tortured you a lot. Sometimes, they cane you, beat you. They sometimes shock you with electricity. They undress you naked.
Darboe became an enemy of the state in 2007 when he spoke out against the arrest of his friend and colleague, Chief Ibrahima Mane. Gambian officials took Mane into custody after he wrote this article criticizing President Jammeh.
I condemned it as a news editor of the paper. I condemned it outright. There were human rights organizations in the country, journalist associations. They organized forums, and I spoke against his arrest.
He further risked his life when he fled the Gambia to testify in a court case held for Mane in Nigeria.
If I don't stand for him, who's going to stand for him? I could be the next victim. And who's going to stand for me if I don't stand for Chief?
The court ordered that Darboe be released immediately, but to this day, Mane's whereabouts remain a mystery.
They never attended the court, and they not, cooperative with the judgment of the ECOWAS court.
Darboe feared being killed if he returned to the Gambia after his testimony, so he remained in Ghana for 9 months until he received asylum in the U.S. Though he's safe in America, he longs to reunite with his loved ones.
I miss my aging father. I miss my sisters.
For Darboe, the restoration of peace in the Gambia is the dream he holds dearest to his heart. For independent sources, Abi Ishola.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
In the meantime, be independent-minded.